CEO throws black woman out of his luxury resort. Just one call, she became his new boss. The name Morrison fell from her lips like a death sentence, and Stephen Ashford, who had spent 23 years running from his past, finally understood that some debts can never be buried, only inherited. Stephen Ashford froze. After 23 years of running, she'd found him. One name, Morrison, and his entire fake life crumbled in real time. But that revelation was still hours away. If you are ready to enjoy this story, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, and comment below where you are watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Azure Coast Resort, its golden light doing little to warm the cold heart of Stephen Ashford as he stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. At 52, he possessed everything the world measured success by: a hospitality empire spanning 3 continents, a net worth that fluctuated by millions with each market breath, and the kind of influence that could reshape skylines with a single phone call. Yet the reflection staring back at him revealed a man hollowed by decades of calculated indifference. His breakfast sat untouched on the mahogany desk, organic berries and artisanal coffee growing cold, while he studied quarterly reports that showed another record-breaking season. The numbers should have brought satisfaction. Instead, they felt like prison bars, each digit another layer of separation between himself and a world he no longer knew how to touch. Stephen's fingers drummed against the window, a nervous habit he'd developed in recent months. Below, his staff moved with choreographed precision across the resort's pristine grounds. Guests lounged by infinity pools that seemed to spill into the ocean beyond. Everyone looked content, purposeful, alive in ways that felt foreign to him. The penthouse was a monument to solitude. No photographs graced the surfaces. Stephen had learned long ago that memories were liabilities. No personal touches disrupted the designer's vision of contemporary perfection. Even the art on the walls had been selected by consultants, beautiful pieces that meant nothing to the man who owned them. His reflection caught his attention again, and Stephen forced himself to really look. Gray had crept into his dark hair, lines mapped the territory around his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. When had he become this man? When had success started feeling like a slow death? The intercom's sharp buzz pierced his reverie like a blade through silk. "Mr. Ashford," came his assistant Rebecca's voice, professionally neutral as always. "The morning reports are ready for your review." "Send them up," Stephen replied, though he made no move toward his desk. The routine would continue: reports, calls, decisions that affected thousands of lives while touching none of them, including his own. 300 miles away, in a modest hotel room overlooking a parking lot instead of an ocean, Diana Morrison sat cross-legged on a bed that had seen better decades. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where Stephen's world was all marble and gold, Diana's temporary space was carpet stains and flickering fluorescent lights. Yet her eyes held a fire that had been absent from Stephen's reflection. Purpose burned there, hot and unwavering. Spread before her on the faded comforter were documents that represented years of meticulous research. Legal papers, financial records, newspaper clippings, and photocopied contracts created a paper trail that led back 23 years to a partnership that had ended in betrayal. At the center of it all sat a framed photograph of a woman with Diana's eyes and a smile that spoke of dreams not yet broken. Evelyn Morrison. Brilliant architect, visionary developer, Stephen Ashford's first business partner, and Diana's mother. Diana's fingers traced the edge of the photograph with the kind of reverence reserved for religious artifacts. Her mother looked so young in the picture, so full of hope and determination. The photo had been taken at the groundbreaking ceremony for what should have been their first major development together, a mixed-use complex that would have revolutionized affordable housing in Detroit. Instead, it had become the funeral pyre of Evelyn Morrison's dreams. "I'm going to make this right, Mama," Diana whispered to the photograph, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "He's going to face what he did to you. To us." The hotel room felt smaller with each passing minute, thick with the weight of generational pain and carefully nurtured anger. Diana had grown up in the shadow of her mother's ruin, watching a once vibrant woman slowly crumble under the weight of betrayal and financial devastation. Evelyn had never stopped believing that Stephen would eventually do right by her, that their friendship meant something, that justice would prevail. She had died still believing. Diana rose from the bed and moved to the room's single window, looking out at a world that had never offered her the luxury of Stephen's marble towers or ocean views. She had fought for everything: scholarships that paid for her education, jobs that funded her law degree, connections that opened doors reluctant to admit someone like her. Every achievement had been earned twice over, first through merit and then through persistence in the face of doubt. But she had made it. Harvard Law, corporate litigation, a partnership track at one of Boston's most prestigious firms. Everything her mother had dreamed of, but never lived to see. And now, finally, she had the tools to demand an accounting. Diana's reflection in the window showed a woman of 30, beautiful in the way that came from inner strength rather than external enhancement. Her natural hair was pulled back in a professional bun, her dark skin glowing with health and determination. She wore a simple black dress, the kind that could transition from business meeting to courtroom to confrontation with equal effectiveness. The briefcase at her feet contained more than just legal documents. It held the power to destroy Stephen Ashford's carefully constructed empire, to expose the corruption that had built his fortune on her mother's grave. One phone call to the right investigative journalist. One filing with the appropriate regulatory body. One well-timed revelation to his board of directors. But Diana wanted more than Stephen's destruction. She wanted him to look into her eyes and understand what his choices had cost. She wanted him to feel, for just one moment, the helplessness her mother had experienced as her life crumbled around her. She wanted justice, but she also wanted him to remember her mother's name. Diana checked her watch, an elegant piece that had been her mother's, one of the few valuables that had survived the financial devastation. In 2 hours, she would walk into the Azure Coast Resort. She would present herself not as a threat, but as a potential client. She would let Stephen's own prejudices and assumptions work against him. And then, when the moment was right, she would speak the words that would bring his world crashing down. "My name is Diana Morrison." The irony wasn't lost on her. Her mother had taught her that hospitality was about welcome, about making every person feel valued and seen. Now Diana would use Stephen's own resort to show him exactly how far he had fallen from those ideals. She moved back to the bed and carefully gathered the documents, placing each one in its designated folder with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The photograph of her mother went into a special pocket in her briefcase, close to her heart. As Diana prepared to leave the hotel room, she caught sight of herself one final time in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her carried the hopes of a dead mother and the dreams of a better future. She was armor and vulnerability, strength and sorrow, justice and love all wrapped in one determined package. In a few hours, Stephen Ashford would look into these same eyes and see his past come calling. He would learn that some sins echo across generations, that some debts grow with interest, and that sometimes the children of the destroyed return not for revenge, but for something far more powerful, the truth. CTA, have you ever had to confront someone from your family's past? What would you do if you discovered a loved one had been wronged by someone now successful? Share your thoughts below. Justice or forgiveness? Diana closed the hotel room door behind her and walked toward her destiny, carrying her mother's memory like a torch in the darkness. Across the state, Stephen Ashford continued his morning ritual of isolation, unaware that his carefully ordered world was about to collide with a force he had never seen coming. The reckoning was finally at hand. The Azure Coast Resort's lobby was a cathedral of wealth, all soaring ceilings and imported marble that whispered of exclusivity with every footstep. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across surfaces polished to mirror perfection, while the gentle splash of a central fountain provided a soundtrack of manufactured serenity. This was Stephen Ashford's kingdom, a place where money didn't just talk, it sang opera. Diana Morrison stepped through the massive glass doors and felt the weight of every gaze that followed her movement across the marble expanse. She had expected this. In a world of subtle prejudices and coded exclusions, a young black woman walking confidently into a space like this would always draw attention. She had armored herself for exactly this moment. Her heels clicked against the marble with measured precision as she approached the concierge desk, her briefcase held with casual confidence. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully chosen, The tailored black dress that spoke of professional success, the simple gold jewelry that suggested refinement without ostentation, the natural elegance that no amount of money could buy or fake. "Good morning," Diana said to the concierge, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding courtrooms. "I'd like to speak with someone regarding private event planning. I represent a foundation looking to host a significant fundraising gala." The young man behind the desk, his nameplate read Jason, smiled with the kind of practiced politeness that barely concealed his assessment. His eyes took in her appearance, categorizing and calculating in ways he probably didn't even realize he was doing. "Of course, miss. May I ask which foundation you represent?" "The Morrison Foundation," Diana replied, watching carefully for any flicker of recognition. There was none. Stephen Ashford had buried her mother's name so thoroughly that even his own staff had never heard it. "We focus on educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. Our annual gala typically generates several million in donations." The mention of millions shifted something in Jason's demeanor, but not enough. Diana could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to pursue a lucrative booking versus the discomfort of her presence in his pristine lobby. "I see," he said, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Well, I'm afraid our event coordinator is quite busy today. Perhaps you could leave your information, and we could contact you about availability." "That won't be necessary," Diana interrupted gently, producing a business card with letterhead that spoke of serious money and serious connections. "I only need a few minutes to discuss our requirements. We're considering several venues, but I've heard exceptional things about Azure Coast." As Jason examined the card, Diana became aware of the attention she was drawing from other staff members. A security guard had positioned himself with a clear view of the concierge desk. The front desk manager kept glancing over with an expression that suggested she was a problem to be managed rather than a client to be served. "Miss Morrison," Jason said finally, "I really think it would be better if you scheduled an appointment. We have very specific protocols for." "Protocols for what, exactly?" Diana's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk now. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the intersection of prejudice and opportunity that would give her the opening she needed. Before Jason could respond, the front desk manager, a woman whose blonde hair and pinched expression suggested she'd never encountered a problem money couldn't solve, approached with the kind of smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No problem at all," Diana replied smoothly. "I was just explaining our foundation's interest in hosting an event here. The Morrison Foundation has a budget of—" "Ma'am," the manager interrupted, her voice taking on the particular tone reserved for people she considered beneath her notice, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private establishment, and we maintain certain standards." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame. Around them, the lobby's carefully orchestrated activity continued, but Diana could feel the shift in atmosphere. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. The crystal chandeliers seemed to cast harsher light, and the marble beneath her feet felt suddenly cold. "Standards," Diana repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see." This was it. This was the moment her mother had faced, when dignity meant more than safety, when standing tall in the face of humiliation became an act of resistance. Diana felt Evelyn Morrison's spirit flowing through her, strengthening her spine and steadying her voice. "And what standards would those be exactly?" Diana asked, her legal training taking over. "I'm a potential client representing a legitimate charitable foundation. I have proper identification, business credentials, and a significant budget. Which of your standards am I failing to meet?" The manager's face flushed, caught between the obvious nature of her prejudice and the need to maintain plausible deniability. "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Security can escort you out if necessary." As if summoned by her words, 2 security guards materialized nearby, their presence a clear threat wrapped in professional courtesy. Diana looked at them. Young men probably not much different from the students her foundation actually did help, and felt a wave of sadness wash over her anger. "Of course," she said quietly, making no move to leave. "Security." Because a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase and speaking politely about a charity event is clearly a threat to your standards. It was then that the elevator chimed, its soft ding cutting through the tension like a bell tolling the hour of judgment. Diana felt rather than saw the shift in the lobby's energy as every staff member suddenly straightened, their attention drawn to whoever had just arrived on the main floor. Stephen Ashford stepped into his lobby like a king surveying his domain, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Diana saw him as he truly was, a man who had built his empire so high that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. He was handsome in the way that money and good genetics often combine to create, but there was something hollow in his eyes, an emptiness that all his wealth couldn't fill. He moved with the unconscious authority of someone who had never been told no, never been made to wait, never been forced to justify his presence anywhere. The staff parted before him like water, their deference so complete it was almost choreographed. "Mr. Ashford," the manager called out, relief flooding her voice as she spotted her salvation. "There's a situation here that requires your attention." Stephen's gaze swept across the tableau, his manager's flustered expression, the security guard's ready stance, and finally, inevitably, it landed on Diana. For a heartbeat, she saw confusion flicker across his features. She didn't fit the narrative his staff was trying to present. She was too composed, too professional, too obviously not the threat they were treating her as. "What seems to be the problem here?" Stephen asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could silence boardrooms and reshape city skylines. Diana felt the moment crystallize around them, time slowing as destiny finally arrived. She looked directly at Stephen Ashford, the man who had destroyed her mother's life, who had built his fortune on Evelyn Morrison's grave, who had no idea that his past had finally come calling. "The problem," Diana said, her voice carrying across the marble expanse with perfect clarity, "is that your staff seems to believe I don't belong in your establishment." She paused, watching recognition fail to dawn in his eyes. He didn't know her. Of course he didn't. She had been 8 years old when he'd betrayed her mother, just a child whose future he'd casually destroyed without ever learning her name. "My name is Diana Morrison," she continued, her voice steady as stone. "I represent the Morrison Foundation. We've been trying to arrange a meeting regarding your outstanding obligations." The name hit Stephen like a physical blow. Diana watched the color drain from his face, saw his carefully controlled expression crack like glass under pressure. 23 years collapsed into a single moment as the past reached out to claim him. "Morrison," he repeated, the word barely audible above the lobby's ambient noise. "Yes," Diana said, taking a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Evelyn Morrison was my mother, and you, Mr. Ashford, are the man who destroyed her life." The silence that followed was profound, thick with the weight of buried sins and unpaid debts. Around them, the resort's carefully orchestrated luxury continued its dance, but Diana and Stephen existed in a bubble of reckoning where nothing mattered except the truth finally spoken aloud. Stephen's mouth opened, then closed, words failing him for perhaps the first time in decades. His staff looked between them in confusion, unable to process the shift from ejection to whatever this was becoming. "You're her daughter," Stephen said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder or horror or both. "I am," Diana confirmed, her chin lifting with the pride her mother had taught her. "And I've come to collect what you owe." The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their prismatic light, the marble fountain kept up its gentle song, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean waves crashed against the shore with eternal rhythm. But in the center of Stephen Ashford's pristine lobby, the past had finally caught up with the present, and nothing would ever be the same again. What would you do if you came face to face with someone who had wronged your family decades ago? Would you seek justice, revenge, or try to understand their side? Let us know in the comments. Diana stood there in her simple black dress, surrounded by luxury she had never known but carrying a power that money couldn't buy, the power of truth, finally spoken after 23 years of silence. And Stephen Ashford, for the first time in his adult life, found himself completely and utterly without defenses against the reckoning he had always known would come. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with 23 years of unspoken guilt and carefully buried pain. Stephen felt the lobby's marble floor shift beneath his feet, as if the very foundation of his empire had cracked. Around them, his staff remained frozen in tableau. Security guards poised for action they no longer understood. Managers caught between protocols that suddenly seemed meaningless. "I think," Stephen said carefully, his voice finding its authority again like a man grasping for a lifeline, "we should continue this conversation in private." But Diana didn't move. She stood in the center of his pristine lobby like an immovable force, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that made his carefully constructed defenses feel paper-thin. "Private?" she repeated, her voice carrying just loud enough for the gathered staff to hear. "The way you privately destroyed my mother while publicly building your empire on her ruins?" Stephen's jaw tightened. The businessman in him, the part that had survived boardroom battles and hostile takeovers, began to reassert itself. This was damage control now. Crisis management. He could handle this. "Ms. Morrison," he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice, "I understand you're upset, but this is neither the time nor the place for—" "For what?" Diana interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "For truth? For accountability? Tell me, Mr. Ashford, when exactly would be the appropriate time to discuss how you let my mother take the fall for your failed development deal? When would it be convenient for you to explain how she lost everything while you walked away clean?" The words hit their mark. Stephen felt heat rise in his chest, not just guilt, but anger. He had worked too hard, come too far, to have his past dragged into his present by someone who didn't understand the complexities of what had happened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice taking on the edge that had cowed countless competitors. "That situation was complicated. There were legal issues, regulatory problems." "Complicated," Diana repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "That's what you call it. My mother spent her life savings on that project. She put her reputation on the line. She trusted you." "And I trusted her," Stephen shot back, then immediately regretted the words. But the damage was done, and his pride wouldn't let him retreat. The deal went bad. Sometimes that happens in business. It wasn't personal. The silence that followed was different now, charged with electricity that made the air itself feel dangerous. Diana's eyes narrowed, and Stephen saw something flicker there that made him take an unconscious step backward. "Not personal," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that was more terrifying than screaming. "You want to know what personal looks like, Mr. Ashford? Personal is an 8-year-old girl watching her mother cry at the kitchen table because the woman she trusted most had abandoned her. Personal is growing up in a studio apartment because we lost our house. Personal is watching my mother work 3 jobs to keep us fed while you built this palace." Stephen's manager cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Ashford, perhaps we should call security too." "No." The word came out sharper than Stephen intended. The last thing he needed was this scene escalating further, especially with guests beginning to notice the commotion. A small crowd had gathered at the edges of the lobby, phones discreetly pointed in their direction. "Everyone back to work," Stephen commanded, his voice carrying enough authority to scatter his staff like leaves. But the damage was done. The perfect facade of his lobby had been cracked, and cracks had a way of spreading. Diana watched the staff disperse with something that might have been satisfaction. "Afraid of witnesses, Mr. Ashford? Worried about what your guests might think if they knew how you really built this empire?" "What do you want?" Stephen asked bluntly, abandoning any pretense of politeness. "Money? Is that what this is about? How much?" The slap came so fast Stephen barely saw it coming. Diana's palm connected with his cheek with a crack that echoed off the marble walls, leaving a burning impression that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the shock of being touched by consequence. "Don't," Diana said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Don't you dare reduce my mother's life to a dollar amount. Don't you dare think you can pay your way out of this like you've paid your way out of everything else." Stephen's hand went to his cheek, more from surprise than pain. No one had laid a hand on him in anger since he was a child. The sensation was almost alien, immediate, real, completely outside his ability to control or negotiate. "You want to know what I want?" Diana continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want you to remember her name. Evelyn Morrison. Say it. Ms. Morrison. Say her name." Diana stepped closer, close enough that Stephen could see the unshed tears in her eyes, the way her hands trembled with emotion held too long in check. Say my mother's name and admit what you did to her. Stephen felt the walls of his carefully constructed world pressing in around him. Everything in his experience told him to lawyer up, to have security remove her, to treat this like any other business crisis that could be managed and contained. But something in Diana's eyes, a grief so profound it made his own isolation look like luxury, held him frozen. This is not how these things are handled, he said finally, grasping for the familiar protocols of corporate conflict. If you have a legal complaint, there are proper channels. Legal channels? Diana's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Like the legal channels my mother tried to use 23 years ago. The ones that mysteriously disappeared when your lawyers got involved. The system that protected you while she lost everything. I didn't, Stephen started then stopped. Because hadn't he? When the regulatory investigation began, when the questions started getting uncomfortable, hadn't he made calls? Hadn't he used connections, pulled strings, ensured that if someone had to fall, it wouldn't be him? You didn't what? Diana pressed, sensing his hesitation like a shark scenting blood. You didn't abandon her? You didn't let your lawyers paint her as the incompetent partner who'd made the mistakes? You didn't quietly restructure your assets while she faced bankruptcy? Each accusation landed like a physical blow, stripping away the justifications Stephen had built over the years. He had told himself it was survival, business, the harsh reality of a competitive world where sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. But it did happen that way, Diana replied, her voice softer now but no less dangerous. And you let it. You chose your empire over her life. Stephen looked around his lobby, at the marble he'd imported from Italy, the chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, the carefully curated luxury that proclaimed his success to the world. For the first time in years, it all felt hollow, like a beautiful tomb for the man he might have been. She was my partner, he said, the words coming out like a confession. She was brilliant, creative. She saw possibilities where others saw problems. She was also your friend, Diana added, watching his face carefully. She trusted you. Stephen closed his eyes, and for a moment he was 29 again, full of dreams and ambition, working late nights with Evelyn Morrison planning developments that would change the world. She had believed in him when no one else would, had seen potential in a kid from Detroit with more vision than capital. When he opened his eyes, Diana was still there, still waiting, still carrying her mother's pain like a torch in the darkness. What happened to her? He asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. She never recovered, Diana said simply. Not financially, not emotionally. She spent years trying to rebuild, but the bankruptcy followed her everywhere. No one would trust her again. She died 5 years ago, still believing you might someday do the right thing. The words hit Stephen like a physical blow. Evelyn was dead. The brilliant, vibrant woman who had helped him build his first success was gone, and he had never known. Never tried to find out. Never looked back to see the wreckage he'd left behind. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but necessary. I'm truly sorry for your loss. Sorry doesn't bring her back, Diana replied, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Sorry doesn't undo 23 years of struggle. Sorry doesn't make right what you made wrong. Stephen nodded, unable to argue with the truth of her words. They stood there in his marble cathedral, two people divided by history and hurt, while around them the normal business of wealth and privilege continued its careful dance. So what now? Stephen asked finally. What do you want from me? Diana looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to see past the years and success to the man her mother had once trusted. Justice, she said simply, but not the kind your lawyers can negotiate away. Not the kind your money can buy. Real justice. The kind that requires you to face what you've done and choose to be better. Before Stephen could respond, the soft chime of the elevator announced another arrival. Diana glanced toward the sound, then back at Stephen, her expression shifting slightly. This conversation isn't over, she said, adjusting her briefcase with renewed purpose. We're going to talk about this properly. All of it. But not here, not like this. Where? Stephen asked, surprising himself with how quickly he agreed. Somewhere without your security guards and your staff and your marble walls, Diana replied. Somewhere you can't hide behind your empire. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. Oh, and Mr. Ashford? The next time one of your staff tries to throw someone out based on the color of their skin, you might want to remember this moment. You might want to ask yourself what your mother would think of the man you've become. With that, Diana Morrison walked across his lobby and out of his resort, leaving Stephen Ashford standing alone among his crystal and marble, finally understanding that some storms couldn't be weathered with money, and some debts came due no matter how long you ran from them. The reckoning had only just begun. The storm hit Azure Coast 3 hours after Diana Morrison walked out of Stephen Ashford's lobby, as if nature itself had been waiting for the right moment to trap them together. What began as distant thunder and darkening clouds quickly escalated into a full coastal tempest, with winds that bent palm trees horizontal and rain that fell in sheets, so thick the ocean disappeared behind walls of water. Stephen stood in his penthouse office, watching the storm transform his pristine resort into something wild and uncontrollable. Emergency protocols were already in motion. Guests had been moved away from oceanfront rooms, outdoor activities canceled, and the staff shifted into crisis mode. But his mind wasn't on hurricane preparations. It was on Diana Morrison and the accusation that had followed him up 30 floors like smoke from a fire he couldn't extinguish. What your mother would think of the man you've become. His mother had been dead for 15 years, but her voice still echoed in quiet moments. A nurse from Detroit who had worked double shifts to put him through college, who had taught him that character was measured not by what you achieved, but by how you treated people who couldn't help you achieve it. She would have been ashamed of what had happened in his lobby, ashamed of what he'd allowed to happen to Evelyn Morrison. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Ashford, we have a situation." Stephen pressed the button with more force than necessary. "What kind of situation, Rebecca?" "The bridge into town is flooded. The coast road is completely impassable. We have guests who were supposed to check out today, and—" She paused. "Ms. Morrison is still on the property. She was trying to leave when the storm hit. Her car broke down in the parking lot." Stephen closed his eyes. Of course the universe would conspire to keep them both trapped in the same space when all he wanted was time to process what she'd told him, to figure out how to live with the knowledge that Evelyn Morrison was dead and he had never even tried to make it right. "Where is she now?" "The lobby." "She's—" Another pause. "She's helping coordinate the guest relocations. She said she has hospitality experience." Stephen opened his eyes, staring out at the storm with new understanding. Diana Morrison wasn't just Evelyn's daughter, she was her mother's daughter. When crisis struck, she didn't retreat or demand special treatment. She rolled up her sleeves and helped. "I'll be down," he said, cutting off Rebecca's response. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, each floor a countdown to another confrontation he wasn't prepared for. But when the doors opened on the main level, the scene that greeted him was unlike anything he'd expected. The lobby had been transformed into an efficient command center. Guests sat in comfortable clusters while staff members provided updates and refreshments. Children were occupied with activities that had materialized from somewhere, and elderly guests had been given priority seating near the warmth of the central fireplace. At the center of it all was Diana Morrison, moving with the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught. "Mrs. Chun, I understand your concern about your medication," Diana was saying to an elderly woman near the concierge desk. "Let me check with the medical staff about what we can do to ensure you have everything you need until the storm passes." Stephen watched, transfixed, as Diana handled each crisis with the same calm competence she'd shown when confronting him. A young father worried about his toddler's food allergies. A honeymoon couple anxious about missing their flight. A business traveler whose presentation materials were trapped in his flooded car. Diana addressed each concern with the kind of personal attention that Stephen's staff, for all their training, sometimes missed. Mr. Ashford, his general manager, Patricia, appeared at his elbow. "Thank goodness you're here. The situation is more complex than we initially thought. The storm is expected to last at least 12 hours, possibly through tomorrow morning. We have 97 guests who can't leave, and we're running short on available rooms." Stephen nodded, but his attention remained on Diana. She had moved to the family with the toddler and was kneeling down to the child's level, making the little girl giggle despite the chaos around them. "Sir?" Patricia prompted. "How many rooms do we have available?" Stephen asked, forcing himself to focus. 37. We'll need to arrange some creative solutions. Suites can accommodate extra guests, and we have rollaway beds, but it's still going to be tight. And Diana Morrison? Patricia followed his gaze. She didn't request a room. Actually, she's been more help than half my staff. She suggested we open the conference rooms as family areas, set up the business center as a quiet workspace for guests who need to work, and coordinate with our kitchen to provide continuous food service rather than scheduled meals. It's brilliant, actually. It was brilliant. And it was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Evelyn Morrison had been known for, seeing solutions where others saw only problems. A crash of thunder shook the building, causing several guests to look nervously toward the windows. Diana immediately stood and addressed the room with calm authority. "Everyone, that was just thunder," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the space. "The building is completely safe. These windows are designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, and the resort has backup generators for power. You're in one of the safest places you could be during a storm like this." Her words had an immediate calming effect. Conversations resumed, tension visibly decreased, and several guests actually smiled. Stephen found himself walking toward her before he'd consciously decided to move. "Ms. Morrison," he said as he approached. She turned, and for a moment her composure slipped. He saw exhaustion beneath the competence, the emotional toll of their earlier confrontation layered under her professional demeanor. "Mr. Ashford," she replied carefully. "I was just saving my reputation," Stephen finished. "Patricia tells me your suggestions have been invaluable." Diana straightened slightly, as if remembering she was supposed to be angry with him. "I'm not doing this for you. These people needed help." "I know," Stephen said quietly. "It's exactly what your mother would have done." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Diana's eyes searched his face, looking for mockery or manipulation, and finding neither. "You didn't know her," Diana said finally. "Not really." "I knew enough," Stephen replied. "She had this way of seeing what needed to be done and just doing it. No committees, no focus groups, just action guided by compassion." A small smile ghosted across Diana's lips. She used to say that hospitality was about making people feel safe when they were far from home, that it was a sacred trust. And you learned from her. "Everything I know about leadership, I learned watching her pick up the pieces after you destroyed her life," Diana said, but the words lacked the venom of their earlier confrontation. Exhaustion had worn away her armor, leaving truth in its place. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, sent a ripple of unease through the assembled guests. Stephen looked around the lobby, seeing his resort through Diana's eyes, not as a monument to his success, but as a responsibility to the people who had trusted him with their safety and comfort. "What else do we need to do?" he asked. Diana blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "What? You've been handling this crisis better than my trained staff," Stephen said. "What else needs to happen to get these people through the night?" For a moment, Diana just stared at him. Then her professional instincts took over, and Stephen saw the brilliant mind that had earned her a place at Harvard Law School. "The families with small children need quieter spaces," she said, warming to the subject. "The conference rooms would work, but they need activities and maybe some kind of movie setup. The elderly guests need medical attention checks. Storms can be stressful for people with heart conditions or anxiety. And everyone needs regular updates. Uncertainty breeds panic." Stephen nodded, already mentally organizing his staff. "Done. What else?" "Food service needs to be continuous but organized. Maybe stations in different areas rather than trying to seat everyone in the main restaurant. And," she hesitated, "and people need to feel like they have some control. Give them small jobs, ways to help. It's psychological, but it works." Stephen found himself smiling for the first time in hours. "Evelyn really did train you well." "She trained me to survive," Diana corrected. "To adapt. To never depend on anyone else to solve my problems." The unspoken accusation hung between them. She had learned those lessons because he had made them necessary. But for the moment, the immediate crisis took precedence over their personal reckoning. "Ms. Morrison," Stephen said formally, "would you be willing to serve as acting assistant manager for the duration of this emergency? I'll pay you consultant rates, of course, but more importantly, I think these guests need your expertise." Diana studied his face, clearly weighing his motives. Why? Because you're better at this than anyone else in the building right now, Stephen said honestly. Because these people deserve the best care we can provide. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because it's what she would have done. Another long moment of assessment. Then Diana nodded once, crisply. Consultant rates are $500 an hour, she said. And I work directly with you, not through your managers. Agreed. And when this storm is over, we finish our conversation. Stephen met her eyes, seeing the steel beneath the exhaustion. Agreed. As they turned to address the crowd of stranded guests, Stephen caught a glimpse of their reflection in the lobby's windows. Two figures silhouetted against the storm, working together despite everything that lay between them. For the first time since Diana had spoken her mother's name, he felt something other than guilt settling in his chest. It might have been hope. Have you ever found yourself working alongside someone you had conflict with during a crisis? Sometimes shared purpose can bridge the deepest divides. Share your thoughts. Can people really change when circumstances force them to show their true character? Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the Azure Coast Resort, two people who had every reason to be enemies began the delicate work of becoming something else entirely. By midnight, the Azure Coast Resort had settled into an unusual rhythm. The storm continued its assault on the coast, but inside, Stephen and Diana had created something that felt less like an emergency shelter and more like a community. Families clustered in the converted conference rooms, their children finally asleep despite the thunder. Business travelers typed quietly in the repurposed meeting spaces. Elderly guests dozed in the comfortable chairs by the fireplace, watched over by staff who had volunteered for extended shifts. Stephen found Diana in the business center, reviewing food inventory reports by the blue glow of a laptop screen. She had shed her professional blazer hours ago, working in just her black dress with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Somehow, the casual look made her seem younger, more vulnerable, and Stephen could suddenly see the 8-year-old girl who had watched her mother's world crumble. The kitchen staff says we have enough food for breakfast, but lunch might be challenging if the storm doesn't break, Diana said without looking up. I've put together some contingency plans. Diana. Stephen's voice was quiet, tired. It's midnight. The staff can handle things for a few hours. You need to rest. She finally looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the screen's glow. I don't have a room. The simple statement hit Stephen harder than it should have. Here was a woman who had spent the entire evening ensuring his guests' comfort, and he hadn't even thought to provide her with a place to sleep. Of course, he said quickly. We'll get you set up in one of the suites immediately. That's not necessary. I can sleep in one of the conference rooms with the other overflow guests. Absolutely not. Stephen pulled out his phone. Rebecca, I need the presidential suite prepared immediately. Yes, I know what time it is. No, it's not for me. Diana watched this exchange with something between amusement and suspicion. Presidential suite? That's not necessary for someone you're planning to sue into oblivion. Stephen ended the call and looked at her seriously. Is that what you think I'm going to do? Isn't it? Isn't that how powerful men like you handle problems that won't go away? The question hung between them, loaded with decades of cynicism and hard-earned wariness. Stephen could see in her eyes that she had learned not to trust the kindness of men with power, that every offer came with strings attached. I don't know what I'm going to do, Stephen admitted. But litigation isn't going to bring your mother back or undo what happened. And tonight I've seen who you are, who she raised you to be. Destroying that wouldn't serve anyone. Diana saved her work and closed the laptop, studying Stephen's face in the sudden darkness of the room. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows across his features, making him look older, more human than the polished executive she had confronted in the lobby. Tell me about her, Diana said suddenly. About my mother. In the beginning, before everything went wrong. Stephen was quiet for so long that Diana thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories he had spent years trying to forget. She was fearless, he said. I was 29, fresh out of business school, full of theories but no real experience. Your mother had been working in development for 5 years already, and she knew things I couldn't learn from textbooks. She saw potential in neighborhoods that other developers wrote off as too risky, too complicated. Diana leaned back in her chair, hungry for stories about a mother she had never seen in a professional context. What was your first project together? A mixed-income housing development in Detroit. Everyone said it was impossible, that low-income and market-rate housing couldn't coexist successfully. But Evelyn had this vision. Stephen's eyes grew distant. She designed these beautiful townhomes with different price points but identical exteriors. No one could tell which units were subsidized and which weren't. It created real integration, real community. That sounds like her, Diana said softly. She always believed architecture could solve social problems. The project was her baby. She worked 18-hour days, charmed city officials, negotiated with contractors who didn't want to take her seriously because she was a woman. She made it happen through sheer force of will. Stephen stood and walked to the window, watching the storm rage beyond the glass. We were going to change the world, you know. We had plans for developments in 6 cities, each one designed to break down economic barriers. Evelyn called it invisible integration, communities where your income didn't determine your neighbors. Diana felt her chest tighten. These were dreams she had never heard about, a version of her mother's ambitions that had died before Diana was old enough to understand them. What went wrong? She asked, though she already knew the answer would hurt. Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his reflection ghost-like in the window. Everything. The first development was a success, but success brought attention. Regulatory scrutiny. Questions about our financing, our approval processes. Someone had been cutting corners with permits, and suddenly we were facing federal investigations. Someone, Diana repeated, her voice sharp. You mean my mother? No. Stephen turned from the window, his face etched with an old pain. I mean me. The corner cutting, the questionable permits, the regulatory shortcuts, that was all me. I was impatient, young, convinced that the ends justified the means. Your mother had no idea what I'd done until the investigators showed up. Diana felt the world shift beneath her, the carefully constructed narrative of her childhood cracking like ice. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother was innocent, Stephen said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. She trusted me to handle the legal aspects while she focused on design and community outreach. She never knew about the bribes, the falsified documents, the shortcuts I took to speed up approvals. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain against glass and Diana's heart beating so loud she was sure Stephen could hear it. Then why? Diana's voice broke. Why did she take the fall? Stephen closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 52 years. Because I was a coward. When the investigation started, my lawyers told me I had 2 choices. Take responsibility and face federal charges that would have meant 15 to 20 years in prison, or let the evidence point toward Evelyn as the managing partner who oversaw those aspects of the business. You let them frame her. I didn't have to let them do anything, Stephen said bitterly. I had structured the partnership to protect myself. On paper, she was responsible for regulatory compliance. When the investigators found the falsified documents, they found her signature on them, signatures I had forged. Diana stood so abruptly that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. You forged her signature? I forged everything, Stephen confessed, the words tumbling out like blood from a wound that had never properly healed. Permits, contracts, compliance documents. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix everything once we got the projects off the ground. But when the investigation started, every piece of fraudulent paperwork led back to her. Diana was pacing now, her hands clenched into fists. She went to prison for crimes you committed. No, Stephen said quickly. She never went to prison. My lawyers worked out a deal, financial responsibility, but no criminal charges. But the civil penalties, the fines, the legal fees, they destroyed her financially. And her reputation was ruined, Diana finished. No one would work with her again because they thought she was incompetent at best, criminal at worst. Stephen nodded, unable to speak. Diana stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a fury that made their earlier confrontation look like a gentle disagreement. And you? What happened to you while my mother lost everything? I restructured, Stephen admitted. Quietly dissolved the partnership, moved my assets offshore, started over with a new company. Within 2 years, I was developing luxury resorts instead of affordable housing. Safer, less regulatory oversight, higher profit margins. You got rich while she got destroyed. Yes. The simple admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Diana stared at Stephen as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and what she saw made her step backward. Do you know what she told me about you? Diana asked, her voice deadly quiet. Even after she lost everything, even when we were living in a one-bedroom apartment and she was working as a night janitor to pay the rent. You know what she said? Stephen shook his head, dreading the answer. She said you must have had a good reason. She said the Stephen Ashford she knew would never abandon a friend unless he had no choice. She spent 23 years believing you were a good man who had been forced into an impossible situation. The words hit Stephen like physical blows. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself, feeling the weight of Evelyn's misplaced faith crushing down on him. She defended you, Diana continued, tears streaming down her face now. Even on her deathbed, when the cancer was eating her alive and we couldn't afford the good treatments, she defended you. She said partnerships were complicated, that sometimes good people made bad choices, that she forgave you. Stephen felt something break inside his chest, a dam of guilt and self-loathing that had been holding back 23 years of suppressed emotion. Diana, She forgave you, Diana repeated, her voice rising. But I don't. I will never forgive you for what you took from her. From us. From me. With that, Diana grabbed her briefcase and walked toward the door, leaving Stephen alone in the business center with the storm raging outside and the full weight of his sins finally, completely revealed. For the first time in decades, Stephen Ashford sat down and wept, for Evelyn Morrison, for the man he had been, and for the daughter whose mother had died still believing in a goodness that had never existed. Dawn came quietly to the Azure Coast Resort, filtering through storm clouds that had finally begun to break apart after 12 hours of relentless assault. The lobby, which had been a command center through the night, now felt like the aftermath of a battle. Furniture displaced, emergency supplies scattered, and the exhausted but relieved faces of guests who had weathered the storm together. Stephen hadn't slept. After Diana left him in the business center, he had spent the remaining hours of darkness walking the resort, checking on guests, coordinating with staff, and trying to process the crushing weight of truth he had finally spoken aloud. Every step through his marble halls felt like walking through a graveyard of his own making. He found Diana in the presidential suite's sitting room at 7 in the morning, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed a coastline littered with debris, but touched by the gold of returning sunlight. She was still wearing the black dress from yesterday, now wrinkled from a sleepless night, and she was holding a framed photograph that Stephen recognized with a jolt of memory. She kept a picture of us, Diana said without turning around, her voice hoarse from crying. From the groundbreaking ceremony for that first development. You're both smiling like you're about to change the world. Stephen approached carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile peace had settled between them. In the photograph Diana held, he could see his younger self, eager, ambitious, standing next to Evelyn Morrison, whose smile radiated the kind of confidence that came from believing in both her partner and their shared vision. We thought we were, Stephen said quietly. Change the world, I mean. We had such plans. She framed it, Diana continued, still not looking at him. Kept it on her desk through everything, the bankruptcy, the moves to smaller and smaller apartments, the years of struggle. I used to ask her why she didn't throw it away, and she'd say, because it reminds me of when we believed impossible things were possible. Stephen felt the familiar knife twist of guilt, but something else too, a desperate need to understand the woman he had betrayed. Diana, I need you to know something about your mother, about who she was before I destroyed everything. Diana finally turned from the window, and Stephen was struck by how young she looked in the morning light. Without her professional armor, exhausted by grief and revelation, she looked heartbreakingly like her mother had at that age. She wasn't just brilliant, Stephen continued. She was kind in a way that's rare in business. I remember once, we were touring a potential development site in a rough neighborhood. There was this elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, who owned a small house right in the middle of our planned complex. Everyone told us to use eminent domain, to force her out. Diana settled into one of the suite's chairs, cradling the photograph like a precious artifact. What did my mother do? She spent 3 weeks visiting with Mrs. Patterson. Not negotiating, just talking. Learning about her life, her late husband, her grandchildren who visited every Sunday. And then Evelyn redesigned the entire development around that little house. Created a community garden right next to it, so Mrs. Patterson would have neighbors and purpose. A ghost of a smile touched Diana's lips. That sounds like her. She always said buildings should serve people, not the other way around. The project cost us an extra $100,000 and 6 months of delays, Stephen said. My business advisors called it financial suicide. But when it was finished, Mrs. Patterson became the unofficial mayor of the development. She organized block parties, welcomed new residents, made that community come alive in ways no architect could design. And you learned something from that? Stephen was quiet for a moment, thinking about the man he had been then versus the man he had become. I learned that your mother understood something I didn't. That success without soul is just very expensive emptiness. Diana studied his face, searching for deception, and finding only tired honesty. Then what happened to you? How did that man become someone who could forge documents and let an innocent woman take the blame? The question Stephen had been asking himself for 23 years hung between them like a challenge. He moved to the window, looking out at his resort grounds where maintenance crews were already beginning storm cleanup. Fear, he said simply. When the investigation started, when I realized I might lose everything, my freedom, my future, my dreams, I got scared. And scared people make choices they never thought they'd make. That's not an excuse. No, Stephen agreed. It's not. It's just the truth. I told myself I'd find a way to make it right later, that I'd help Evelyn rebuild once I got back on my feet. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to face what I'd done. And then success made it easier to forget. Diana set the photograph on the coffee table between them, the image of their younger, more hopeful selves a silent witness to the conversation. She never stopped loving you, Diana said quietly. Not romantically, she was clear about that. But she loved you like a brother, a partner, a friend who had understood her dreams. That love is what killed her, Stephen. The betrayal of it. The use of his first name was so unexpected that Stephen felt another crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Diana had stopped seeing him as just the enemy who had destroyed her mother. She was seeing him as a human being who had made unforgivable choices. I don't deserve her forgiveness, Stephen said. Or yours. No, you don't, Diana agreed. But the question isn't what you deserve. The question is what she would want me to do with the truth now that I know it. Stephen turned from the window to find Diana watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What do you think she would want? Diana was quiet for a long time, turning her mother's photograph over in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. She'd want me to understand that people aren't just their worst moments, Diana said. She'd want me to remember that the man who forged those documents was also the man who redesigned a development to save one elderly woman's home. She'd want me to ask what could be built from the ruins rather than what else could be destroyed. And what do you want? Stephen asked. Diana met his eyes directly. I want my mother's legacy to mean something. I want the dreams you two shared to not die with her. I want. She paused, as if surprised by her own words. I want to believe that good people can still choose to do good things, even after they've done terrible ones. Stephen felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the guilt that had calcified around his heart over the decades. Not forgiveness, he didn't expect that, didn't deserve it, but possibility. The chance that Diana Morrison might see him as more than just the villain in her mother's story. A soft knock at the suite door interrupted the moment. Come in, Diana called. Rebecca, Stephen's assistant, entered with a breakfast tray and an apologetic expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the bridge is clear now. Guests are beginning to check out, and there are some media requests about how the resort handled the emergency. Diana and Stephen exchanged a look. The outside world was reasserting itself, threatening to pull them back into their respective roles as adversaries. Handle the media requests through our standard channels, Stephen said. And Rebecca? Make sure they know that our exceptional emergency response was coordinated by our consultant, Diana Morrison. Rebecca nodded and left, but not before Diana caught the meaningful look she gave Stephen. Word would spread quickly through the resort that the CEO was treating the woman who had confronted him yesterday as an honored colleague today. You didn't have to do that, Diana said. Yes, I did, Stephen replied. It's the truth. Last night, you saved my reputation and my guests' comfort. You showed the kind of leadership your mother would have been proud of. Diana picked up a piece of fruit from the breakfast tray, her first food in nearly 24 hours. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about why I really came here. Stephen felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? I didn't come here just to confront you about the past, Diana admitted. I came here to destroy you. I have evidence, documentation, witness statements. I was planning to take everything to the media, to your board of directors, to federal investigators. I wanted to watch your empire crumble the way my mother's life did. The admission should have terrified Stephen, but instead he felt an odd sense of relief. The waiting was over. The other shoe had finally dropped. But last night changed things, Diana continued. Watching you work alongside me, seeing how you treated your staff and your guests during the crisis, I saw glimpses of the man my mother believed in, and I realized that destroying you wouldn't honor her memory. It would just create more destruction. Stephen sat down across from Diana, the weight of her mercy almost harder to bear than her anger had been. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe there's another way, Diana said. Maybe instead of tearing down what you've built, we could build something together. Something that would make her proud. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate more than just the room. It touched the possibility of redemption, of second chances, of two people damaged by the same history, finding a way forward together. Partners? Stephen asked, hardly daring to hope. Diana looked down at the photograph of her mother and his younger self, two people who had once believed they could change the world through shared vision and determination. Partners, she agreed, and for the first time since she'd walked into his lobby, Diana Morrison smiled. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not through revenge, but through choosing to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. Have you ever had to choose between justice and mercy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Outside, the storm clouds continued to break apart, revealing blue sky and the promise of clear weather ahead. Inside the presidential suite, two people who had every reason to remain enemies began to imagine what they might accomplish together, carrying forward the dreams of a woman who had believed in second chances, even when she had every right to demand retribution. The morning's fragile peace lasted exactly 4 hours. Diana was in Stephen's office, reviewing the resort's community outreach programs and discussing how they might expand their charitable initiatives, when Stephen's phone rang. She watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end, watched the color drain from his features, and his jaw tighten with what looked like panic. I understand, Stephen said finally. Yes, I'll handle it personally. No, don't say anything to anyone until I figure out what's happening. He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment before looking at Diana with an expression she couldn't quite read. What's wrong? Diana asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. That was my head of security, Stephen said carefully. It seems someone has been asking questions about you. Very specific questions. About your background, your finances, your legal practice. Diana went very still. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone has been conducting a thorough investigation into your life for the past several weeks. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to become an inferno. Diana felt the careful trust she had begun to build crumble in real time, replaced by the familiar armor of suspicion and betrayal. You've been investigating me, she said, her voice deadly quiet. While I was pouring my heart out to you last night, while I was choosing to trust you instead of destroying you, you've had people digging into my private life. Diana, it's not what you think. Isn't it? Diana stood abruptly, her chair rolling backward to hit the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Stephen's desk. What exactly did you think you'd find? Some weakness you could exploit? Some leverage you could use against me? Stephen stood as well, reaching toward her with hands that she backed away from as if they were weapons. Please let me explain. Explain what? That you're exactly the man I thought you were? That last night was all an act designed to make me drop my guard, so you could gather intelligence on me. No. Stephen's voice cracked with desperation. Diana, I initiated that investigation 3 weeks ago, before I ever met you. Before I knew who you were or why you were coming here. 3 weeks ago? Diana's eyes narrowed. How could you possibly have known? She stopped. the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. You knew I was coming. Somehow, you knew I was investigating you. Stephen's silence was confirmation enough. How? Diana demanded. How did you know? Stephen moved to his desk and pulled out a file folder, thick with documents and photographs. He handed it to Diana with hands that trembled slightly. Because I've been having your mother's grave monitored for the past 5 years, he admitted. I hired a service to place flowers there monthly, and to alert me if anyone ever came looking for information about her. When you started visiting regularly, when you began asking questions about her past, they contacted me. Diana opened the folder and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Inside were photographs of her visiting her mother's grave, copies of her inquiries to various city offices about old development records, documentation of her meetings with her mother's former colleagues. Her entire investigation into Stephen's past had been observed, catalogued, analyzed. You've been watching me, she whispered, flipping through page after page of her own life reduced to surveillance reports. For months. I needed to understand what you wanted, Stephen said, his voice pleading for understanding she no longer felt capable of giving. I needed to know if you were a threat to my business, my employees, your empire, Diana finished, her voice rising with each word. You needed to protect your precious empire from the daughter of the woman you destroyed. Did you laugh when you read these reports? Did you find it amusing that I was working night shifts to afford a private investigator while you had a whole team tracking my every move? Diana, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. She threw the folder back at him, papers scattering across his mahogany desk like evidence of his betrayal. You played me. Last night, this morning, all of it was performance. You already knew everything about me, about my motivations, about my plans. You knew exactly what to say to neutralize the threat I represented. Stephen came around the desk, desperation making him bold enough to move closer despite her obvious fury. That's not true. Yes, I knew who you were when you walked into my lobby, but everything else, everything I felt, everything I said, that was real. Real? Diana laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Was it real when you told me about my mother's kindness? Did you practice that speech? Was it real when you cried about the past, or was that just another manipulation? It was real, Stephen said, his voice breaking. Diana, I swear to you, it was all real. The investigation was just information. It didn't change how I felt when I looked into your eyes and saw her daughter. It didn't change the guilt or the regret or the hope that maybe I could finally make something right. Diana was backing toward the door now, shaking her head as if she could physically dislodge his words from her mind. You want to know what the investigation missed? What your surveillance couldn't capture? Stephen nodded, though he looked like a man bracing for a final blow. My mother kept a journal, Diana said, her voice thick with tears of rage and heartbreak. Every day for 23 years, she wrote about her hopes that you would contact her, that you would explain what had happened, that you would remember the friendship you'd shared and reach out. Stephen's face crumpled. Diana. She wrote about me, Diana continued, relentless in her need to wound him as deeply as he had wounded her. About how she hoped I would never become bitter, never let what happened to her turn me into someone who couldn't trust or love or believe in second chances. She was so afraid that your betrayal would poison me against the possibility of finding good people in the world. Please. Congratulations, Stephen, Diana said, reaching for the door handle. You've finally succeeded in destroying something else she built. Me. The daughter she raised to believe in forgiveness and redemption and the possibility that people could change. She paused at the door, looking back at him with eyes that held nothing but contempt and disappointment. She was wrong about you then, and I was wrong about you now. You're not a good man who made bad choices. You're just a man who got very good at hiding who he really is. Diana, wait. But she was already gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. Stephen stood alone in his office, surrounded by the scattered papers of his investigation into the woman he had just lost, finally understanding that some betrayals cut so deep they severed not just trust, but the very possibility of redemption. Outside his windows, the sun continued to shine on his pristine resort, guests enjoying the post-storm clarity, staff moving with efficient purpose. Everything looked exactly as it had before Diana Morrison walked into his life. But Stephen knew with crystal certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. He had finally found someone who could see past his sins to the man he might have been, and his own paranoia and control had driven her away. The investigation that was meant to protect him had become the weapon that destroyed the only chance he'd had at genuine redemption in 23 years. Stephen sank into his chair and stared at the photographs scattered across his desk. Images of Diana visiting her mother's grave, Diana working late into the night, Diana living the life of struggle and determination that his betrayal had forced upon her family. He had known all of this and still let himself believe that she could forgive him, that they could build something meaningful together. But Diana Morrison was Evelyn Morrison's daughter in every way that mattered. She had inherited not just her mother's intelligence and compassion, but also her capacity for trust. And Stephen Ashford had just proven, once again, that he was fundamentally unworthy of that gift. The reckoning was complete. This time, there would be no coming back from what he had lost. The silence in Stephen Ashford's office felt heavier than the storm that had passed. For an hour after Diana left, he sat motionless at his desk, staring at the scattered surveillance photos that documented her life. Evidence of his paranoia and her pain spread across mahogany like accusations he couldn't deny. Finally, he gathered the papers with mechanical precision, each photograph a reminder of how thoroughly he had betrayed the fragile trust they had begun to build. There was Diana at her mother's grave, kneeling in the rain. Diana leaving the law library at midnight, exhausted from researching cases that paid her bills while she pursued justice for her mother. Diana standing outside his resort 3 days ago, steeling herself for the confrontation that would define both their futures. He had known all of this, had watched her struggle from a distance while convincing himself it was prudent business practice rather than the violation it truly was. Stephen's phone buzzed with messages from his staff, routine resort business that suddenly felt meaningless. A kitchen inventory report, a request to approve marketing materials, a complaint from a guest about pool noise. The empire he had built on Evelyn Morrison's ruin continued its careful operation, indifferent to the emotional devastation playing out in its executive offices. But Stephen couldn't focus on anything except the look in Diana's eyes as she realized the depth of his surveillance. The way her face had changed from hurt to disgust to something worse, complete dismissal. She had looked at him the way she might look at a stranger who had proven himself unworthy of even basic consideration. A soft knock interrupted his spiral of self-recrimination. "Come in," he called, not bothering to look up from the photographs. Rebecca entered with her usual efficiency, but Stephen caught the hesitation in her step. "Sir, Ms. Morrison has checked out. She asked me to give you this." Rebecca placed a sealed envelope on his desk and retreated quickly, leaving Stephen alone with what felt like a final judgment. His name was written on the envelope in Diana's precise handwriting, not Mr. Ashford or Stephen Ashford, just Stephen. Even in her anger, she had allowed him that small dignity. Inside was a single sheet of resort stationery and a smaller envelope marked for Evelyn Morrison's grave. Stephen read Diana's letter first. "Stephen, I'm leaving because staying would compromise everything my mother taught me about forgiveness and dignity. You've shown me that some people are too broken by their own choices to accept redemption, even when it's offered freely. I won't pursue legal action against you. Not because you don't deserve consequences, but because destroying you would make me into someone my mother wouldn't recognize. She raised me to build things, not tear them down. But I need you to understand something. Your surveillance didn't just violate my privacy. It destroyed the possibility that we could have created something meaningful together. Last night, I saw glimpses of the man my mother believed in. This morning, I discovered that man was just another mask you wear when it serves your purposes. The smaller envelope contains a letter my mother wrote to you 3 years before she died. She never sent it because she was afraid it would seem like begging. I found it among her papers after the funeral. Read it or don't, that choice is yours to live with. I hope someday you understand what you've lost. Not just my forgiveness, but the chance to honor her memory by becoming the person she always believed you could be. Diana." Stephen's hands trembled as he opened the smaller envelope. Inside was a single page in Evelyn Morrison's familiar handwriting, dated just 2 years ago. "Dear Stephen, I've started this letter 100 times over the years, and I never know how to begin. How do you reach out to someone who may not want to remember you exist? I'm writing because I'm sick, and the doctors say I don't have much time left. Not months, maybe not even weeks. And I realized I can't die without telling you that I forgive you. I know what really happened with our partnership. I figured it out years ago, when I finally had the emotional distance to examine the evidence clearly. I know you forged my signatures, created false documents. Let me take the blame for your shortcuts. I know you chose your freedom over my future. And I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger was poisoning the time I had left. I forgive you because the Stephen Ashford I worked with, the one who redesigned an entire development to save Mrs. Patterson's house, was real. Fear made you into someone else, but that doesn't erase who you truly are underneath. I have a daughter, Stephen. Diana. She's brilliant and fierce, and everything I hoped she would become despite the struggles my ruin put her through. She's going to be a lawyer. Harvard Law School, can you believe it? She's going to help people the way I always wanted our developments to help people. I worry that she carries too much anger about what happened to us. I worry that my bitterness in her childhood years taught her that the world is full of people who can't be trusted. I hope I'm wrong. I hope she finds her way to forgiveness, because that's the only path to real peace. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and Diana found this letter among my things. She's probably angry. She has every right to be. But Stephen, if any part of the man I once knew still exists inside you, please help her understand that good people can make terrible choices and still find their way back to goodness. The dreams we shared about changing the world through architecture and development, they weren't naive. They were beautiful. Maybe someday you'll remember that and find a way to honor them. I never stopped believing you were capable of becoming the man I thought I knew. I hope you prove me right. With love and forgiveness, Evelyn. Stephen read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his jacket pocket over his heart, and walked to his window overlooking the resort grounds. Below, Diana was loading her luggage into a taxi, preparing to leave his life as suddenly as she had entered it. He watched her move with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the storm, throughout their confrontation, throughout his devastating revelation of surveillance. Even in leaving, she carried herself like her mother's daughter, wounded but not broken, disappointed but not destroyed. Stephen's reflection in the window showed him a man at a crossroads. He could let Diana leave, return to his carefully controlled empire, and live with the knowledge that he had been offered genuine redemption and chosen paranoia instead. Or he could do something that 23 years of guilt and isolation had taught him was impossible. He could choose vulnerability over control, truth over protection, love over fear. Diana was getting into the taxi now. In 30 seconds, she would be gone forever, and with her would go the last connection to Evelyn Morrison, the final chance to honor the woman whose life he had destroyed and whose forgiveness he had never earned. Stephen made his choice. He ran for the elevator, not caring that his staff watched him with confusion and alarm. He ran through his lobby, past guests who turned to stare at the CEO sprinting across marble floors in a $1,000 suit. He ran into the morning sunlight, reaching the taxi just as it began to pull away from the resort entrance. "Wait!" Stephen called, pounding on the taxi's window. "Diana, please wait." The taxi stopped. Diana's window rolled down slowly, revealing a face that had been crying but was now carefully composed. "What do you want, Stephen?" He was breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I want to make a choice I should have made 23 years ago," he said. "I want to choose being the man your mother believed I could be instead of the man my fear made me become." Diana studied his face through the window. "It's too late for that." "Maybe," Stephen agreed. "But I'm going to try anyway. And I'm going to start by giving you something you deserve. The complete truth, publicly acknowledged, with no lawyers or settlements or non-disclosure agreements." He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm sending a press release to every major news outlet in the country. It details exactly what I did to your mother, how I built my empire on her ruin, and how I've spent 23 years avoiding accountability. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know that Stephen Ashford's success was built on fraud and betrayal." Diana's composed mask slipped. "Stephen, what are you doing?" "I'm choosing truth over empire," he said simply. "I'm choosing your mother's memory over my reputation. I'm choosing to finally become worthy of the forgiveness she offered me." He finished typing, and held his finger over the send button. "This will destroy everything I've built. My company, my reputation, my fortune. All of it will be gone. But maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." Diana opened the taxi door and stepped out, standing close enough to Stephen that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes again. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do," Stephen replied. "Because your mother was right. Good people can make terrible choices and still find their way back to goodness. But only if they're willing to pay the price for redemption." He pressed send. In that moment, standing outside his luxury resort in the morning sun, Stephen Ashford finally understood what Evelyn Morrison had tried to teach him all those years ago. That real strength came not from protecting what you had built, but from having the courage to tear it down when it was built on lies. Diana looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of respect, or hope, or even forgiveness. But for the first time in 23 years, Stephen didn't need her approval to know he had made the right choice. He had finally chosen love over fear. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been the Azure Coast Resort's opulent lobby, but the space had been transformed beyond recognition. The crystal chandeliers still hung overhead, but they now illuminated a bustling community center where families filled out housing applications at tables that had replaced designer seating areas. The marble fountain still played its gentle song, but children now tossed pennies into it while making wishes for new homes. Where exclusive luxury had once reigned, the Morrison Ashford Community Development Center now served everyone. Stephen stood in what had been his penthouse office, now converted into a conference room, where he was reviewing applications for their latest development project, a mixed-income housing complex in Detroit that would have made Evelyn Morrison proud. The mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a simple table surrounded by chairs where architects, social workers, and community leaders could collaborate as equals. "The Martinez family has been approved for Unit 3B, Diana said, entering the room with a file folder and 2 cups of coffee. "Single mother, 2 kids, working 2 jobs to get by. Exactly the kind of family this development is designed to serve." Stephen accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Diana's presence had transformed not just his work, but his understanding of what success could look like. She wore jeans and a sweater today, her professional armor replaced by the comfortable clothes of someone who spent her days visiting construction sites and community meetings rather than courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. "That makes 37 families housed this quarter," Stephen said, reviewing the list of new residents. "Evelyn would have loved seeing these numbers." "She would have loved seeing you," Diana corrected gently, settling into the chair across from him. "The real you, I mean. The one who chose truth over empire." The transformation hadn't been easy. Stephen's press release had indeed destroyed everything he'd built over 23 years. His board of directors had fired him immediately. Investors had fled. The luxury resort empire had collapsed in a matter of weeks, sold off to pay legal settlements and compensate victims of his past fraud. But from those ashes, something unexpected had grown. Diana had returned to Azure Coast 3 days after Stephen's public confession, not to gloat over his downfall, but to offer something he had never expected: partnership. Real partnership, built on truth rather than surveillance, equality rather than power dynamics. "I've been thinking about my mother's journal again," Diana said, pulling out a worn leather book that had become their informal guide for the development center's philosophy. The entry from March 15th, 2 years before she died. Stephen nodded, knowing the passage by heart now. They had read Evelyn's words aloud at every board meeting, every community gathering, every moment when they needed to remember why they were doing this work. "True development isn't about building structures," Diana quoted from memory. "It's about building communities where every person has the dignity of a home they can afford and neighbors who see their worth. Architecture should serve love, not profit." "She always understood what it took me decades to learn," Stephen said. "That success without soul is just very expensive emptiness." A knock at the door interrupted their reflection. Rebecca entered, Stephen's former assistant who had chosen to stay with the nonprofit despite the massive pay cut, claiming that meaningful work was worth more than luxury. "The groundbreaking ceremony is ready to begin," Rebecca announced. "The community is gathered, the mayor is here, and the news crews are set up." Stephen and Diana exchanged a look that held 6 months of shared struggles, unexpected discoveries, and growing trust. Today they would break ground on their third development, a project that would house 50 families and include community spaces designed by the residents themselves. "Ready?" Diana asked. "Ready," Stephen confirmed. They walked together through the center, past offices where Diana's legal clinic provided free services to families facing eviction, past classrooms where Stephen taught construction skills to unemployed workers, past a gallery displaying architectural plans designed by the communities they served rather than imposed upon them. Outside, a crowd of several hundred people had gathered for the ceremony, residents of their previous developments, families hoping to qualify for the new housing, community leaders who had initially been skeptical of Stephen's transformation, but had been won over by consistent action rather than empty promises. Stephen took the microphone first, looking out at faces that represented not wealth or status, but genuine community. 6 months ago, I stood in front of cameras and confessed to crimes that had destroyed a good woman's life and built my fortune on her ruin. Today, I stand before you not as a CEO or a billionaire, but as someone who has learned that redemption isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice, every day, for the rest of your life. Applause rippled through the crowd, warm but measured. Stephen had earned their respect through months of showing up, of doing the work, of proving that his transformation was real rather than performative. This development exists because of Evelyn Morrison's vision and her daughter Diana's courage, Stephen continued. But it exists for you, for families who deserve homes they can afford, for children who deserve safe places to play, for communities that deserve buildings designed with love rather than profit margins. He handed the microphone to Diana, watching the crowd's energy shift as she stepped forward. Where Stephen represented redemption, Diana embodied hope, the possibility that the children of the wounded could choose healing over revenge, building over destruction. "My mother used to say that every building tells a story," Diana said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "Luxury developments tell stories of exclusion, of who belongs and who doesn't. But the buildings we create together tell different stories, stories of inclusion, of second chances, of communities that choose to lift each other up." Diana paused, looking directly at Stephen with an expression that held not quite forgiveness. That was still a work in progress, but something more valuable, partnership built on shared purpose rather than shared guilt. "Today we break ground not just on 50 new homes, but on the possibility that broken things can be rebuilt better than they were before," Diana continued. "That people who have made terrible choices can choose to make better ones. That love, finally, can triumph over fear." The crowd erupted in genuine celebration as Diana and Stephen took the ceremonial shovels and broke ground together. Cameras captured the moment, the former billionaire and the daughter of the woman he had betrayed, working side by side to build something beautiful from the ruins of the past. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the news crews packed up their equipment, Stephen and Diana found themselves alone at the construction site. The ground they had broken was small, just symbolic patches of earth, but it represented something larger. Proof that transformation was possible, that people could choose to become better than their worst moments. "Do you think she would be proud?" Stephen asked, looking out at the community that had gathered to celebrate new beginnings. Diana followed his gaze, seeing not just the crowd but the larger vision they were working toward, a world where Evelyn Morrison's dreams of inclusive development could finally be realized. "I think she would be amazed," Diana said honestly. "Not just by what we've built, but by what we've become. 6 months ago, I came here planning to destroy you. Now. Diana smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Stephen had seen from her since that morning in the presidential suite. "Now I think we're building something she could never have imagined. Something better than revenge or forgiveness, something like family." The word hung in the air between them, surprising them both with its rightness. Not the family of blood or marriage, but the family of shared purpose, of people who had chosen to transform their pain into something productive, their guilt into something good. As the sun set over their construction site, Stephen and Diana stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when people chose love over fear, truth over control, redemption over revenge. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean waves crashed against the shore with eternal rhythm, and in a small cemetery across town, Fresh flowers appeared weekly on Evelyn Morrison's grave, placed there not by a surveillance service, but by two people who were finally, truly honoring her memory. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we choose to build something new rather than tear something down. Have you ever seen someone completely change their life to honor a wrong they committed? Share your thoughts on whether true redemption is possible and what it looks like when people choose love over fear. Sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just new beginnings. The Morrison Ashford Community Development Center had helped house over 200 families in 6 months, but more importantly, it had proven something that Evelyn Morrison had always believed: that architecture could serve love, that broken people could choose to heal, and that the children of the wounded could choose to build rather than destroy. In the end, Diana Morrison had become her mother's daughter in the most profound way possible, not through carrying forward her pain, but through transforming that pain into something beautiful. And Stephen Ashford had finally become the man Evelyn Morrison had always believed he could be, not through avoiding consequences, but through embracing them and choosing to use them as the foundation for something better. Love had triumphed at last, not through forgetting the past, but through transforming it into a future worth building together.